In this video, we'll introduce the nervous system. So let's start off with an overview and just some important points to start with. If you think about the nervous system really it's you, your whole conception of self, the universe, perception of self, it's all tied in with the functioning of the nervous system. So yes, the nervous system does control perception and your experiences of the world. It forms your memories. You understand your relationship with everything around you based on the nervous system, which is a pretty amazing feat for a collection of cells and tissues. So let's just remind ourselves that it really is about your perception of the world and your experience of the world. And I think that's important to keep in mind as we go through the next few chapters. So it is the seat of consciousness, personality, learning, and memory. And as I've written here, it's you. And we'll come to back to that point every now and then. Now, that being said, it's also about homeostasis. And we're talking about homeostasis. The nervous system, of course, is a big system involved, and the endocrine system. And in many ways, they cover many of the same things, but they do it in different ways. And they also have a different approach in terms of speed and how long the effect lasts. This is just a generality, but the nervous system tends to be very quick to react, but its effects tend to be short-lived. Whereas the endocrine system is much slower to react, yet its duration of effect is much longer. But both of them have a role in things like respiration, blood pressure, body temperature, your sleep-wake cycle, blood pH, and the list goes on and on. And not surprisingly, as we go through the next number of chapters and get into the endocrine system, we will see that there's a real homology between what they do. And there are a couple of key places in the body where the two systems talk to each other and exist side by side. And two examples of that would be in the pituitary and also in the adrenals. So let's start talking about how we can subdivide the nervous system. Now, we got to remember that the nervous system is one big system. But for our convenience as humans, we tend to like to break it down into segments or chunks. So we tend to view the nervous system as two main components, and that would be the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And of course, the central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. And when we're looking at the central nervous system, we're talking about billions of nerve cells, neurons, and then we're going to see there's also support cells called glial cells. The spinal cord is as we said, part of the central nervous system. And it begins at an opening in the base of the brain called foramen magnum. And that literally translates into big hole. So it's the big hole on the base of your skull. And of course, it continues down and is associated with the vertebrae. Not as many neurons. There's millions of neurons, so fewer than the brain. But what's the job of the spinal cord? It's about carrying sensory information into your central nervous system. Motor information is information that will influence the action of muscles or glands. And also there's some integration that can happen in the spinal cord. So both of those together, the CNS is the brain and the spinal cord. Now the PNS are all the nerves outside the skull and the vertebral column. So it's everything else. And let's just define, before we go too far, nerves. Nerves are really axons of neurons that are bundled together. And they're actually, nerves are quite complex because you have a series of axons that are bundled together. They have blood vessels, there's connective tissue wrapped around it, and we'll have a look at sort of the anatomy of those down the road. And of course, the job of the peripheral nervous system is to collect information from receptors. So think about in your skin, touch, pressure, vibration, temperature, all these modalities of perception. The information gets carried by neurons, which are bundled together as nerves, in the PNS to bring it into the CNS. And also nerves can carry motor information back to muscles and to glands to have them do their job. They become the effectors, and we'll introduce those terms. Now, when we're looking at the nerves, we can see that there is one big group of them, which we're going to call the cranial nerves, and that's 12 pairs of nerves that travel to or from the brain. And we'll have a look at those. And then we have spinal nerves, and not surprisingly with a name like this, is that these are pairs of nerves traveling to or from the spinal cord. And we see that in between, these are vertebrae I'm drawing, and what we have is between each vertebrae, we have a pair of spinal nerves that exit in between. So once again, the peripheral nervous system is made up of a group of nerves. Nerves are axons that are bundled together with blood vessels, connective tissue, and also we can break them into two major groups, the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves. And here's just a diagrammatic representation that we have the CNS, the brain, of course enclosed in the skull, and the spinal cord. Spinal cord actually terminates here, and we'll come back and talk about that in the future. And when we look over here, we can see here are the spinal nerves, which come off between that. If we actually drew the vertebrae would be in there. And of course, up here in the head, and that's the domain of the cranial nerves. Now, we can start to break the nervous system into functional categories. So that first grouping or way we divide it was based on location. But let's look at sort of from a functional. And when we're talking about functions, we have sensory, which is what you think it is. It's your ability to sense things around you: heat, touch, vibration, pressure, sight, hearing, taste. Then we have a lot of parts of the nervous system. A lot of neurons are involved in integrative. They're often called interneurons. And these integrative neurons are the ones that decide, do we keep the information? Do we just jettison the information? Just say, hey, we got the information, thanks, but no thanks, not going to do anything with it. Or they create a plan of action. And information that travels down neurons that will head out to things like muscles and glands to carry out the action, we're going to call motor. So functionally, we can talk about sensory neurons, integrative, sometimes called interneurons, and motor. So let's start with sensory. So when we're talking about sensory, we're talking about the afferent division. So we have to get used to this. In the nervous system, a lot of the same things have two different names, and it's just something we have to live with. So sensory, also known as the afferent, begins with letter A, not to be confused with one coming up, which is efferent. This gathers information about internal or external environments, and it has input from the two subdivisions below. So information is typically carried from receptors to the spinal cord and or the brain by either spinal or cranial nerves. Depends where you're collecting the information. Now, when we look at the sensory part, or the sensory division, we can break that into two parts. One is called somatic. Think soma. Soma means body. Somatic sensory division. This is about, it's also known as the special sensory division. It carries signals from skeletal muscles, bones, joints, skin. So stuff, think about skin, it'd be touch, pressure, temperature, etc. Also from organs of vision, hearing, taste, smell, and balance. So that is one subdivision, the somatic. Another one is the visceral sensory division. And remember, viscera means organs. So this transmits signals from things like the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, the stomach, urinary bladder. So the sensory, also known as the afferent, you can break it down into the somatic and the visceral sensory divisions. Just going to mention a little bit about the integrative functions. Okay, so when we bring sensory information in, not all sensory information is actually consciously thought about or perceived, and a lot of the information is just jettisoned. We never act on it. But we have to determine that somewhere. And then we also have to determine, if I am going to act on it, how am I going to act on it? And that's the role of the integrative functions. They analyze, they interpret, incoming sensory information. And almost all the information, sensory information coming in, is subconsciously basically disregarded as unimportant. And that's okay. Now, the remaining sensory stimuli that the CNS does responds to leads to a motor response. So the typical pathway is sensory information travels in, then I have the integrative function, usually in the central nervous system. Most of the information is just jettisoned. The information that I act on, a plan will be put together, and that is transmitted by the motor part of the nervous system. Now let's have a quick look at motor functions. So motor functions are carried out by the motor division, and also known as efferent, with the letter E, right, versus afferent. So it's easy to confuse those terms at two. So motor is efferent. So the motor, efferent division, we have motor neurons, and these carry out motor functions, and these typically travel from brain, spinal cord, via either cranial or spinal nerves to the effectors. Now, what are the effectors? They're the things that are actually going to listen to the signals from the motor division and cause something to happen. So the organs that carry out the effects of the nervous system. And when I look at the motor division, it can actually be subdivided within it. And we have the somatic motor division, and that transmits signals to the skeletal muscles, and typically we think of that as voluntary. Sometimes people call this a voluntary motor division, so they're almost synonymous, somatic motor division or voluntary motor division. And then we have the autonomic nervous system, also known as the visceral motor division. And these neurons carry signals to the thorax, abdominal viscera. And if you think about it, what's in your chest and your abdomen? It's things that are largely involved with homeostasis. So, big role in homeostasis. And they help to regulate secretions of certain glands. Contraction of smooth muscle, contraction of cardiac muscle, involuntary muscles. And so sometimes it's also known as the involuntary motor division. So you can see that we keep breaking large groupings into smaller ones. So the motor division, just to restate, can be the somatic motor division or the autonomic motor, or the autonomic nervous system, I should say, which is also known as the visceral motor. And you probably know we can even break this down from previous classes, is the autonomic can be both sympathetic and parasympathetic, depending how it acts. Okay, well, we're going to end that quick introduction, and the next one we're going to come back and we're going to start talking about the nervous tissue itself and start to look at things like neurons and the support cells.